Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast, episode 31, a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. Firstly, an apology from me. The sound quality last week was very bad. Normally I listen to it before it goes out, but I didn't. I just uploaded it and then listened to it later, and then it wasn't ideal. Sound was a bit rubbish. I'm sorry. There was a few crackly noises and off-putting bits, so that's my fault, and I'm trying to get it right. I try and record in all sorts of glamorous places. I think I said before, in my caravan, etc. That sometimes works quite well, but the moment it starts to rain, we have an issue. I'm currently sat in a conservatory at home with a blanket over my head because it's blowing an absolute hoolie outside. This is the second of the big major storms that the UK is having at the moment, very high winds. So I'm trying not to pick up all the wind noise outside. It's dead glamorous, this podcast stuff, I'm sure there is a solution, and it probably is throwing hundreds of pounds at, studios and microphones and that, but, I'm not making anything from this, so it's, I'm trying to do the best I can, so you'll have to bear with me. Anyway, so that's that out of the way. So, episode 31, it's a continuation of ARVs. We talked about armed response vehicles last week and how much I enjoyed them, really. And this story is probably the joint biggest job of my career, for sure. Now, there's a chance that this might split into 2 episodes on this one incident, depending on how it goes time-wise and the detail that we get into. You do know that I love a tangent. I quite often run off somewhere and to start talking about, something else. But hopefully that's what makes it interesting. So we're basically going to have to play it by ear and just see how this goes. It won't be because I'm trying to keep you on a cliffhanger or I'm trying to be clever and keep you coming back or whatever. It's just simply that I'm trying to keep these two around about half an hour, just because I think that's quite a decent time. If you listen to a podcast when you go for a dog walk or you're working out in the gym or, your journey to work or whatever, it's not too long, it's not too short. So let's just see how it goes. So this incident today then, I'd been on ARVs at this point a couple of years. So again, not vastly experienced, but I had a reasonable amount of experience at this point, and I'd been to quite a few jobs. And certainly by now there was, I think if you remember, I said that I was one of the first people, in fact I was the first group that set up ARVs, armed response vehicles, within the force I was in at the time. We'd been taken from this pool of armed officers that were working at Gatwick, and now we were helping sort of set this up. And it seemed to be working okay. But 2 years in, we'd had kind of second, maybe third wave of people, new people coming on that we needed to replace, because that's the thing about the police, there's this constant flow of people. Not only do the people move on, for promotion, people retire, people just decide for whatever reason they've had enough of a certain role, so they move on elsewhere. That is the great thing about the police, and one of the things I particularly enjoyed about it. I rarely stayed anywhere more than kind of 5-ish years before I moved on and found, a new role. And I was quite lucky, I did a lot of variety of roles, although I think I said before, although I say lucky, these specialist roles, none of them come looking for you. You have to apply, and then there's potentially quite an involved process to go through to then, be selected. So it didn't necessarily come easy. Anyway, the team I was on, there was various people that I worked with, and we rotated round. You didn't have it's not like on the telly where you have like a set partner and you become best of friends with them. There was a team of maybe 10 or 12 of us, and we rotated round. There was no sort of favoritism, and you just work with whoever. You might have a run of a week, for example, with people, but again, by the time people are off sick, on courses, annual leave or whatever, you just can't work with the same person all the time. So it does, very much sort of rotate. And again, that kept it interesting, to be honest with you, because I was very lucky. My team were good, and I got on well with all of them. But certainly, I know that other people perhaps, you always have favourites, and there's people you perhaps prefer to work with. And if you got, somebody that you weren't so keen on, and then you got stuck with them for sort of 6 months or something, that would be hard, I'd imagine. So, but that never really happened to me. So on this particular day, I was crewed up with a guy, and let's call him Alan. It's not his real name, but, to protect his identity, we'll call him Al. And Al had just done his ARV course, so he'd done, and at that point, I think rather than being like me, he'd been an AFO to start with, an authorised firearms officer, and done his 2-week course and then did a 4-week ARV course. I think by this point you had the ability to come straight on from sort of scratch, having never picked up a gun, to 6 weeks later, you're an ARV officer. And it worked quite well, to be honest with you. There was quite a few military that worked with us, but again, I think we've talked about before, that's sometimes not ideal because military way of dealing with things, and in terms of when and when not to fire, and also, police is all about single aim shots, whereas military, laying down, covering fire, putting, a burst of fire and all that, it just doesn't happen in the police. So sometimes it's easier for instructors to train people that have never picked a gun up, than trying to sort of remould military types into the police way of thinking. But generally, by the by, it worked pretty well. So Al had just done his course. He'd done his 6-week course, and he was starting with me as his very first ARV shift. And what a shift it was going to be, as you'll see. So we were working out to the east of our county that night, and at this point, I think we'd either armed up over the east, or we might have collected weapons and things from a central location and then driven out that way. But either way, we found ourselves out, right out on the edge of our county, which meant that we were probably a good 45 minutes drive should we need backup, in terms of armed backup. There was obviously normal cops going about their daily work and doing stuff, and we would back them up. We've talked about this before. If they had a fight or a domestic or something that was getting violent, they need assistance, absolutely we would go. But in the main, as we were armed all the time, certainly with a handgun all the time, they'd be loath to send us into a pub fight, straight off. And generally we would carry the handguns all the time. We had what's called a standing authority for that, so we didn't need authority to self-arm to be able to use that pistol or deploy that pistol ourselves, but generally it was only in set circumstances. And some of those might be, let's say we're driving along the high street and an armed robbery that we know nothing about, sort of spills out in front of us, and a guy comes running out with, a handgun, he's just robbed the bank. Well, that's the scenario where we could self-arm. We wouldn't need extra authority. We carried the handguns and we could draw those weapons and deal with that just off our own back, and that was something that we trained for and were expected to do, Then the long guns, as they were called, so in this case it was the MP5s, 9mm MP5s that were kept in a safe within the vehicle, and that also held our baton gun, which was fires the big sort of rubber bullets, a less than lethal option. We still didn't have tasers at this point. We had the baton gun, and we had the long guns, the MP5s, with extra ammunition carried in the safes, and also we talked about stun grenades last week. They were carried in the safe as well, and that was sort of bolted into the car with a combination on it. So we would only draw those extra weapons if we received an authority from a silver commander, which was a silver firearms commander, who would receive advice from a TACAD, a tactical advisor. He would tell us, I'm giving you armed authority. We would open the safes, get the long guns out, and then arm up and do whatever tactics was meant to be appropriate. Very difficult sometimes for that to be managed locally. So a lot of the time, once you had your authority, there would be a tactic agreed. But this is all kind of nice and slow time. The job we had on this night developed quite quickly. So we found ourselves in this coastal town in the UK, and we were just, doing our normal patrol stuff. If there wasn't an armed job, we'd be driving around and maybe, stopping cars, or, maybe stop searching people if we'd found them in the right circumstances, early hours in the morning. It was a night shift. We'd driven round. We'd already had our refs, as we talk about, which are refreshments. So we had our food, and it was the early hours of the morning. In fact, no, I'll tell a lie. It was earlier than that. It was maybe midnight or something like that. Yeah, midnight, half midnight. So not an awful lot going on this night. It was a weekday. And the first call came in. We were in this, or we were just on the periphery of the sort of town centre, and the first call came in, and it was reports of a male armed with a rifle. That was the very first call. So, of course, immediately our ears pricked up. It's not the sort of call you get every day, particularly as he was meant to be in the street. Now, I have to say, and we've talked about this before as well, that there's quite a few calls that come into the police that we get false calls. Obviously, we get the local kids calling up to say, oh, there's a fire, or someone's just been stabbed, and you turn up and there's a group of kids standing around laughing because they think it's great fun that you've turned up there on blue lights. And you also got a lot of well-intentioned calls. So somebody sees something and then, with the best of intentions, ring us up and say, I've seen a guy with a gun, or I've seen something, whatever it is happen. And when actually you get there and check it out, it's nothing like they've said at all. But, the intentions were there. So we would always thank them and say to them, no problems at all. It's a totally genuine call, and we'd rather have a call from you, get there and find out that actually it's not what you thought, than not have the call at all and we miss something terrible. Excuse me. So this first call that came in, male with a rifle, and immediately Al, my shiny new crewmate who'd just come off his course, who'd not had a live arm job yet, his ears pricked up immediately and he was like, oh, did you hear that? I was like, yeah. He said, what do you think? I said, well, there's loads of things to think at this point. We won't get too excited at this point, but we'll start to just drive towards the police station, just in case, this was to develop. It's always nice to be able to arm up and get the long guns out and things in the backyard of a nick, rather than doing it on the street when you tend to attract a lot of attention, and this was the days before really people sort of habitually got out mobile phones to record everything, but it's just nicer to do it on your own terms. So we started heading back towards the police station, which was about a 15-minute drive. And en route, there was a second and third call came in, very similar to the first, but importantly, totally independent. So it wasn't the same person ringing back 2 or 3 times. This was a new person on each time saying, I've seen a male with a gun in the street, and some descriptions started coming in of the weapon as well. So it was a bit more distinct. A couple of them said like assault rifle, so it wasn't just a gun, a big black gun, it's a bit more descriptive. So it was seeing a guy walking down the street, seems to have some sort of assault rifle, but then I was scared, so I kind of, closed my curtains and ignored him. And they said he seems to be heading into the area of the train station. This town had 2 or maybe 3 train stations, and one of them was kind of a little bit out of the town centre, and that's the one that they said he was heading in the direction of. So I said to Al, right, this is developing a bit now. We might actually get a job out of this. And he was very excited, because as an armed officer, you do want to be deployed to something. It's like soldiers. I was very briefly in the army myself. It wasn't really for me, but, soldiers, I would say, generally want to be deployed, in a war zone, because I think there's this need to, and this is just my own belief, you kind of want to test out what you've been trained for. That certainly years ago there were soldiers that went through an entire 25-year career and never ever got deployed. I always think that they perhaps would have preferred, and people will be going, that's ridiculous, there's a chance you could be shot or killed or whatever. Yes, there is, but certainly from my own point of view as well, I would have hated to be an armed officer and never been deployed to an armed job, because you kind of want to test yourself out. So sure enough, Steve, very first night, his shift, he wants to come out and test his ability. So what happened was, went back to the police station, and we basically awaited to see what would happen. Now, at this point, they're not sending any sort of police officers at all to this job. No unarmed officers would go near this job, because what happens is it immediately gets fired up to this sort of central control room, and then you would get an inspector, initially as like a duty inspector, who runs the control room, and he or she will look and listen at this job, and then they will start probably taking tactical advice initially as to whether this is a spontaneous firearms incident, which is what they're quite often calling the police. I'm sure different forces call them different things, but it was very apparent, because by now I think we were 5 or 6 calls in to different people, independent witnesses, saying they'd all seen a male with a large black gun, an assault rifle, a machine gun, all those sorts of variations. They were coming in, and all from the same place. So this isn't going to be a moody call. This is clearly something genuine. So it very quickly passed to a silver firearms commander who will make the ultimate decision, and then on to a TACAD, so a tactical advisor. They get their heads together, look at the information and say, yes, this is a spontaneous firearms incident. So sure enough, we get the call, we're back at the Nick, and they say, I am going to give you authority, tactics to be decided. I want you to arm up with the long weapons and await further instruction. So sure enough, myself and Al, we're already there. We get the long guns out. I'm driving. So generally, initially, I would stick with just my pistol. But what happened was Steve got an MP5 out for me, which I loaded and made ready. So put a magazine in it and cocked the weapon, made sure that safety catch was on safe. But that weapon is ready to go now. All I've got to do is flick the safety to fire and pull the trigger and it'll go bang. That was carried in a bag, but directly behind my seat, so I could access it very, very quickly. Steve got the baton gun out and initially went with the less than lethal weapon, because you always have to have this less than lethal option. The person could present with a knife, and I may not be able to justify shooting him, and therefore it would be Steve's responsibility to deal with it with the baton gun. So, sorry, I keep getting my names mixed up here. Al, it's Alan. For some reason I keep calling him Steve, I don't know why. So what happens, Al is armed up and he's ready to go. And then we're sat there and we're awaiting further instructions. So the next instruction that comes through is to move closer to the location. Don't commit to it, don't go to it. But just, now we're armed, move into the area so that we're very close should we need to deploy, or while they are deciding what tactics to use. And at the same time, a plain armed car that consisted of 3 armed officers, but in plain clothes, SFO, specialist firearms officers, that were based centrally, are now en route to us on blue lights and heading out as well. They might not be needed, but, we're definitely going to have them should we need them, because, the more the merrier, quite frankly, because at the moment we're only 2 armed officers, and that is not many to deal with a suspect. It doesn't give you a lot of options, especially if this person's not going to comply or kick off. So we moved closer and we waited, and more calls come in. And now, interestingly, about the 7th call we got was from a male claiming to be the one that all the calls had been about. And the call went something like this. He calls up and he says to the control room, I've got a weapon. I've got, and he named the weapon. He called it a Galil, I believe, which is an Israeli sort of standard issue assault rifle. And he said that I used to be in the armed forces. I've stolen this weapon from the army. And then he says, I have hundreds of rounds on me. I've got plenty of spare ammunition. You're going to need to send armed officers to deal with me. And then he goes on to explain that about 3 weeks previous to that, he'd been in the town centre and he'd been stabbed by somebody in an argument about whatever. I don't think he went into why, but he was stabbed 3 weeks prior. He said so he got this weapon and he was going to go and settle some scores, and that, they definitely needed to send armed officers to deal with him. So all of this was adding up to quite a nasty little job, really. We were there with authority. We got a guy that's telling us he's got a weapon. He's in the area. He's kind of armed and dangerous very much, and that he wants armed cops sent there. Now, we've talked before about death by cop and suicide by cop, and that's effectively when somebody has a weapon, whether it's real or not, and deliberately points it at armed cops, knowing almost for sure that he's going to be shot. So rather than commit suicide, he forces the armed officers to do it for him. The problem is, it's something we're aware of, it's something we know happens, but you can't really change that. If you're an armed officer and you go to a scene, where there is meant to be somebody carrying a firearm and he or she raises that and points it at you, almost certainly there is only one decision you're going to take, and that is to pull the trigger. So it's a really difficult one, because if you then find out the weapon isn't real, it does put you in a bit of a difficult position and a difficult mindset, because, you might have to take that person's life. And that's perhaps what they intended all along. But obviously no one wants to kill someone, and that's potentially what you're being forced to do. But these are the risks of becoming an armed officer. These are the things that you have to think about prior to starting this role. And it's very clear, what this role is going to involve. It's not like it's a shock when you go, what? I'm not facing armed people. That's really dangerous. It's very clear. And by the time you get to this point, having had the training you had, you'll have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. Now, for me personally, I always hoped that if I had to shoot someone, it would be very black and white. Lots of people have had really sort of grey shootings in the, they whip something out of their pocket. We talked about one last week. A guy had a chair leg wrapped in a plastic bag, which he raised up and pointed at cops. And cops had been told he had a gun. He had a sawn-off shotgun. So he got shot. It's a bit of a difficult one. And I always hoped that if it had to happen, it would be really straightforward. It would be very obviously a gun or what looked like one, and it would be pointed at me. None of this kind of, fast draw and decisions to be made. Selfishly, I wanted an easy decision should I have to be in that position. But like I said, I didn't want to be, and no one I ever worked with did. So anyway, this continues to develop, and now we are told we haven't got time to wait for the SFOs, because potentially you've got, an armed guy walking around with members of the public who have no protection at all. That is what we were there for. We cannot hold off and wait. And you see this a lot in sort of school shootings in America. I know there's one fairly recently it's happened at, that armed cops, hold off and hold outside a school and don't go in and deal with it. Well, that's fine if there's no one in there. But if you've got someone rampaging around with a gun, we are the armed police. We have to deal with it, because if we don't deal with it, who else is going to? Do you know what I mean? It's an unpleasant thing, but bottom line is someone has got to go and deal with it. And normally in virtually every police role, there's backup available. No matter what you do, there'll be backup and there'll be a specialist team that comes to help you. Well, there's a realisation that you are the specialist team. No one's coming to help you. You're an armed cop. You are armed, and you've got to deal with it. And that's kind of where we were at on this occasion. So we were sent down to the scene initially. So by this time, I'd put my MP5 on the strap around my shoulder, and I had it in my lap. We had folding stock, so I could fold the stock and make it quite small. But remember, this weapon's loaded, made ready, and I've got it either slung across my chest or in my lap and ready to go. Now, one thing I will say is we didn't have seatbelts on either. We'd taken those off at this point. And the reason I'm saying that is because when you've got body armour on and the adrenaline's high, it's very easy to forget to take your seatbelt off, because we're so sort of, brainwashed, aren't we, to wear a seatbelt. And on many occasions, armed cops have turned up for something, intending to spring out of the car and be very dynamic and shout and point guns and all the rest of it, only to find that they look an idiot as they crack open the door, try to leap out to find that they're still seatbelted in. And yeah, it ends up becoming a bit of a farce, quite frankly. So I was absolutely adamant that, was not going to happen to me. So we turned up at this scene, and it's set on a steep hill, and there's an alleyway that leads down to the train station. We spoke to a member of the public, and they said, yes, I've seen him. I've seen the guy with a gun. It's a big gun, bigger than the guns you've got. And I don't think this was a size issue, but she was just pointing out that, it's a big gun, big black gun. Bearing in mind now we're about midnight and it's pitch black. There's street lights, but, the lighting is fairly poor. And she says, I've seen him walk down that alleyway there, and this alleyway I knew led direct to the platform at the train station. Now, the trains, thankfully, were off. There was no trains on. But we hadn't seen anyone at that point at all, only what this woman had told us. So we had a little look around. Obviously, we're reporting all this back as we go along to the sort of superiors and to the Silver and the TACAD. Myself and Al are out, knowing that we're by ourselves, but also, for me, feeling confident that I could deal with whatever came up, because we did have what we needed to. So this alleyway was about 50 to 75 metres long, I'd say, around about 150 foot long maybe. Very narrow, chain link fence on either side, and it led down to the car park. Now, as we're talking about this, about probably half an hour has passed since we deployed to the edge of the scene, of the location. So bearing in mind we've got SFOs, 3 cops in a plain car zooming towards us at breakneck speeds on blue lights. So we know they're going to be with us fairly soon. So at the time, we were just eyes and ears, really. We didn't really want to commit to going down and deal with him by ourselves, as our backup now is fairly close. But equally, we needed to be there because should this guy suddenly take the decision to start firing shots, then, somebody had to deal with him. So that's why we were there, really. But I must admit, I was also, relatively inexperienced and was quite looking forward to the big boys turning up, the ones that actually knew what they were doing, or that's what I felt at the time. So sure enough, another sort of 5 or 10 minutes passes, and thankfully, plain car comes screaming around the corner. Obviously, he's turned off his blues and twos way off, turning up to us so that we don't alert the guy, although he must have been pretty clear that we were there at this point, because bearing in mind, he'd also phoned us. So they turned up, we had a quick brief, quick chat, decided the roles. One of the SFOs had a baton gun as well, and it was decided that he would be our main less than lethal. We had a police dog turning up. The only thing was a firearms dog wasn't available. Now, this isn't a dog, that carries a gun with him. This is a specially trained police dog that works with armed officers. And the main difference being they will attack on command. So your average police dog, if it goes to a riot or to someone mouthing off or whatever and they're in the street shouting and bawling, it will attack them if it needs to basically apprehend them. It'll bring them down, hopefully by the arm, but quite frankly, it could be by the groin, by the, the face, whatever they can get hold of. They're a bit indiscriminate, which is sometimes what makes them so good. But a firearms dog, if you have someone there standing really quietly and not sort of kicking off, that dog, that firearms dog, Trojan dog, as sometimes they're called, can be directed onto the suspect to bring them down, even though they're standing there quietly doing nothing. And you might think, well, that's out of order. Why are you bringing them down? But, you will see exactly why it's useful in a couple of seconds. So what happened was we were stood there on this alleyway, and I looked down the alleyway, which remember is poorly lit, and in the distance I can see a male. So we take up positions behind hard cover. We're semi-behind like brick walls, and I think there was a post box there, which are very heavy metal, that you can sort of get behind. So you're trying to make yourself as small a target as possible. This male walked up, and as he walked up towards us, we could see he was in we would call it like a low port position. He clearly had a very large assault rifle, and it looked to me like an M16, an AR-15, something like that, if that means anything to you. But he was pointing it at the ground. He was not pointing at us, and that's a really important point. So he slowly advanced, quite calmly, not making any noise, not shouting or swearing, just walking towards us at the top of the hill. Now, it's very clear who we were. We were some in uniform, some not. We all had police hats on. We were all very clearly armed with long weapons or baton guns. And what happened was he walked up towards us. Now, the range on the baton gun is about 25 metres, which is quite close. But, it keeps someone at a distance should they want to approach you with, a bat or a knife or something like that, or you need to drop them basically, but without a conventional firearm. So that was the range. Now, as he walked up towards us, there was a lamppost about 25 metres down this hill. And the guy who had the baton gun said, "That's my line in the sand." Now, because we'd all trained with each other and the baton guns, we knew what he meant. That was the point, that if he carried on walking towards us but didn't present a firearms threat, now you might say he is a firearms threat, he's got a gun. Well, yes, but he's not pointing at us. So at this point, he's not getting shot with conventional weapons. The line in the sand is conveniently a dog poo bin that was attached to this lamppost. I always remember it, bizarrely. And the guy that had the baton gun said to me, "Line in the sand," and to the rest of the team, "Dog poo bin." If he comes past that, I'll be shooting him with a baton gun. If he continues to not do what he's told, because at this point, we're screaming and shouting at him, "Armed police, drop your weapon, show us your hands, put the weapon down," and lots of things along those lines. But he just wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting, but he was walking up towards us with this weapon. So, of course, all sorts of things race through your mind. Why is he doing this? And ultimately, we don't know. But the decision was made. If he got within 25 metres, he was going to get shot with a baton gun. And that hopefully would allow us to go forward, or possibly the police dog, because by now the police dog is with us and it's going crazy beside us, because, you know, any time you shout around a police dog, they start to get a bit rolled up. But remember, not a firearms dog. So he closes us down and he gets closer and closer, and he gets to about 30 metres away, and so just past the line in the sand, or just out of range of the baton gun, continues to point the weapon at the ground, doesn't point it at us, doesn't speak to us, doesn't engage, doesn't shout, just stands there and stops. And I was thinking, that is typical. He's just out of range. So now we're in this bit of a, standoff, bit of a Mexican standoff, literally. You know, what are we going to do with this guy? So we tried to engage with him. He wouldn't have it. A decision had to be made. You know, we had to move this forward some way. We weren't going to stand there forever. This is still potentially an armed suspect, you know, with members of the public walking around behind us, or could be. There actually wasn't anyone about because of the time of day, but, you know, all the shouting we were going to do, it was only a matter of time before it brought people out. So what were we going to do with this guy? Well, as we're 31 minutes in, and I'm trying to keep these to half an hour-ish, what we'll do is we'll stop there. Now, I know possibly you're now very frustrated, and I apologise, but you're going to have to wait a week, and we'll look at episode 2, and we will see where this goes. Thanks very much for your time. I hope the sound quality has been all right this week, and thanks for coming back and listening. Good downloads this week, and continue to pass on to friends or anyone you think might be interested. Police Stories Podcast. As you know, we're on all the Spotifys and Audibles and pretty much everywhere, and also on YouTube, Police Stories Podcast, if you want to listen there. So thanks very much. Take it easy. Have a good week, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye.